I've had this question on my mind in the past couple of weeks, and maybe you have as well, as we have seen the news reel in about earthquakes, hurricanes, more hurricanes, destruction, catastrophe. What does faith look like in the eye of the storm? I've heard two pretty consistent responses over the past couple of weeks. The one response is a question. Where is God? God, where are you when people's lives are in ruin? Where is our loving God? The other response that I've heard is a little more surprising. And I particularly heard it in the interviews with the people of Saint Martin and Baruta right after they had lost everything. And their words sounded particularly jarring over our secular news media. Person after person said this: we prayed to God, and God was with us, and we're okay. Thanks be to God. On the one hand, this question, where is God? And on the other hand, this witness, God is right here. Now, I was tempted at first to see these as opposite responses. The question perhaps revealing a lack of faith, that proclamation revealing this awe-inspiring faith. But in going to the biblical witness, to see how our biblical ancestors respond in the eye of the storm, so to speak, what I discovered is that both that question and that proclamation are part and parcel of a life of faith and our relationship with God. Now, going to our first reading today, this takes us into the heart of one of our foundational stories of faith, the story of Passover and Exodus. The people of Israel have been slaves at the hands of a brutal dictator, King Pharaoh. And on this Passover night, those systems of enslavement and fear and violence and brutality, they all come crumbling down with devastating consequences. The firstborn male in every Egyptian household dead on one night. The people of Israel are called to move out of that rubble, to leave behind the only home that they have ever known, and to go out into the complete unknown. The Israelites have a refrain that pops up at every step along the way. When they are suffering in Egypt, when they are freed, when they are in the wilderness, when they make it to the promised land, when they begin their new lives as a new community, trying to live as God's people, the refrain keeps coming up again and again and again. God, where are you? We need you. Where are you, God? The counterpoint to that question is given to them in the Passover supper. They are called on that dark night, as the world is crumbling down around them, they are called to gather in one another's homes, to roast a lamb, to bake bread, and to share that meal together. And this is the witness in that meal. God is here. God is here. God is here, as close to you as the neighbor beside you. as close to you as the food that you are about to eat. And in sharing that meal together, they are brought into the presence of God. More than that, the presence of God is brought into them. The presence of God who sets them free. The presence of God who does guide them through the wilderness. The presence of God who does bring them home. The presence of God who loves them every step of the way. That question keeps coming up, where are you, God? Which is why they are to continue to observe the story of Passover in a yearly remembrance, in a weekly remembrance, as they share in the Sabbath meal, in a daily remembrance, as they are to teach the next generation again and again and again this story of how even in the darkness and the chaos, God is here. God is right here. That story and that observance is passed down through the generations. It's passed down to Jesus. And on his own dark night, when his world is crumbling down, he finds himself gathering with his friends, his disciples, to share that Passover meal. The question is also going to be on his lips. Later that same night, after the meal's done, he'll be in the garden crying out to God in his suffering and anguish. He'll hang on the cross the next day and he will cry out, "My God, why have you forsaken me? God, where are you?" But in that Last Supper, what is revealed to us is that timeless promise of God's presence is actually embodied in Jesus. Jesus is that promise of God with us in the flesh. He shows us what our human life looks like, full of the presence of God, full of the power of God, full of the purpose of God. And he asks his followers to engage in a similar story, a constant story for generations to come. We are also called to gather together around God's table, to say words of blessing over the bread and the wine, and to share that bread and that wine together and to bear witness to this proclamation, the body of Christ. Jesus is here. God with us is here. And as we eat that bread and wine, God with us is also here. We are the body of Christ. We are the presence of God going out into the world. As Christians, we're invited when we come into worship together. We're invited to bring with us the pain of the world. We're invited to bear in our own bodies the loss, the destruction faced by our brothers and sisters all over our world, and particularly in these last couple of weeks. But we also bear our own storms. We have our own heartbreaks and worries and uncertainties and questions that we also bring with us and lay before God in our worship. You might find that question on your lips. Where are you, God? In the eye of the storm, where are you? You need to know that that is a holy question. It's a question that fundamentally assumes a relationship, assumes that our lives are of value, that we are loved, that the one who created us is listening. It's a question that looks expectantly for how God is going to act and how God's love is going to be revealed. As a counterpoint to that question, I pray that each of us, in our worship today and every time that we gather in worship, that we might also hear and receive that promise of God's presence. May you see God's presence in the neighbor who sits beside you this morning. May you feel God's presence in this holy house of prayer where generations have offered their prayers and praises. May you taste God's presence in the bread and wine that we share in communion. May you become God's presence as you are sent out into our world with love. Amen.